Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought. Today, we're excited to have with us Colby Townsend, discussing his article in the fall 2022 issue of Dialogue, The Robe of Righteousness, Exilic and Post-Exilic Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. In this fascinating article, Colby revolutionizes the way that scholars should examine the so-called Isaiah problem in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon contains a significant amount of material from the Book of Isaiah, a key text in the Hebrew Bible. However, there are issues with the use of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, as it is widely accepted in biblical scholarship that the section of Isaiah that the Book of Mormon quotes dates to after the time that Lehi and Nephi leave the land of Jerusalem. This essay examines two problems with the use of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. The first problem is the assumption that none of 2nd and 3rd Isaiah has anything to do with the Book of Mormon. And the second problem is the difficulty of having a block of quotations, including from the first sections of Isaiah chapters 2 to 14, that are unlikely to have existed in that form in the 6th century among 6th century Israelites. There we go. This essay also explores how the use of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon may have been influenced by the King James Version of the Bible and how the book's authors may have accessed and used these texts. Colby, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So first, can you summarize for us how scholars have approached the question of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon before your research?
Yeah, sure. Scholars have been writing about this for about 100 years now. And I'm speaking particularly of scholars. Before Sidney Sperry and one of his students, after he did his master's degree and then PhD at Chicago, his student
H. Grant
Vest. 1920s, yeah, is when Sidney Sperry's at Chicago. He writes a pretty short master's thesis trying to engage with Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. And it's kind of a lot of cut and paste. There isn't a lot of commentary in that thesis. But then about a decade later, he works with H. Grant Vest at BYU. He was in the Seminaries Institutes in the 1930s. And in that thesis, Grant Vest actually called it the problem of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. So for him, it wasn't quotation marks, it wasn't scare quotes, it was just the problem of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. After his thesis was published, which he worked with, of course, Sidney Sperry very closely on the thesis, Sidney Sperry published an essay, I think within the next decade or two, I think in the 40s or 50s, I can't remember the original publication date, called The Problem of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. So initially, Grant Vest, Sidney Sperry, one of the Ludlows, they basically tried to deal with it by saying, yeah, we're directly engaging with Isaiah scholarship, contemporary to us. Here's what they say. But we actually think that the Book of Mormon is good evidence that Isaiah is older. So they just sort of rested it there. They did some work, like H. Grant Vest's thesis was very thorough. Did some work to try to, offer explanations for it actually fitting, a pre, 600 BCE context. But for the most part, just sort of said like their conclusion was the Book of Mormon is evidence that Isaiah is older than what scholars are saying. Another aspect of their work was that they did not reject that the idea that Joseph Smith opened up a King James Bible and dictated the chapters from the King James and then made changes as he went, as he read. That comes later, sometime in the 70s. I haven't ever completely teased out that issue there, and I'm not exactly sure why that happens in Mormon scholarship on Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. But the general conclusion from Sidney Sperry, H. Grant Vest, and I didn't mention him yet, but just B.H. Roberts as well. The general conclusion was that, the Book of Mormon is evidence that Isaiah is older, that it fits, just fine in that context. And they kind of moved on and, tried to study what the Book of Mormon was doing with Isaiah. So Monty Nyman, a handful of others. There were actually a few master's theses at BYU in the 60s and 70s as well that tried to analyze this through the lens of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, what are the variants between the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts and, the Masoretic text, basically what you have in the King James. And yeah, they all came to that same conclusion that, the Book of Mormon is evidence of a earlier Isaiah. So you have that. And then it's really not until the work of David Wright that you have like a really thorough examination of the problem. And in a essay that eventually gets published in the early 2000s, he argues that the variance in the Book of Mormon between the text of the Isaiah text of the Book of Mormon and the King James text, the variants indicate that whoever is working, with changing the text of Isaiah only knows it in English. That's pretty much the basic argument. And he focuses almost completely on Deutero-Isaiah, which is 40 through 55. But it's a really thorough examination. David Wright is one of the best scholars of the Hebrew Bible that there is still. And that's a really good essay. Definitely recommend. I recommend all of this literature. I mean, it's all really fun to dig into and explore. But through all of that, pretty much everybody had agreed there's no third Isaiah. We don't have to worry about that. The quotations of 48 through 54, a little bit of 55, are there, but maybe we can just sort of argue that there's a core to Deutero-Isaiah that goes back to Isaiah. We don't have to worry about Isaiah 2 through 14. That's in First Isaiah, so it's Isaiah, right? So the engagement with biblical scholarship was a little bit superficial in that way, and remains so, because there is no way to argue from, like if you're really in mainstream biblical scholarship, going to the Society of Biblical Literature, engaging with the variety of scholars and a variety of backgrounds and approaches, there really is no way to argue that 48 through 54 is some sort of core that goes back to Isaiah. And also with 2 through 14, as I show in the essay, it has a far more complicated composition history than is assumed. And so, basically try to invite scholars to engage more directly with biblical studies, because that hasn't happened as much in Mormon studies.
So basically, as sort of scholars that looked at the Book of Isaiah over the last, before Latter-day Saint scholars started looking at this, they had divided it up into three big chunks. Historical Isaiah, or First Isaiah, comprising of chapters 1 to 39, Second Isaiah of chapters 40 to 54, 55, and Third Isaiah from 55, 56 to 65, right? One of the big questions was, well, what do we do with the fact that there are some sections from the later or Second and Third Isaiahs potentially in the Book of Mormon? And you're saying nobody ever thought there was any Third Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, but some people were defending that Second Isaiah was perhaps authentically First Isaiah based on the fact that it was in the Book of Mormon. At least that's how some Latter-day Saint scholars were approaching the issue. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, definitely. And I think particularly that end part is the work of Kent Jackson from the 80s up until his most recent work, I think was an essay in Laura Harris Hale's book, Reason for Faith, I think it's what it's called, or something like that. But he had an essay in there that he kind of put together based on two essays he had written in the 1980s. And that's his basic argument, that There is no third Isaiah. You just have to kind of like, the only problem is, 48 through 54. And maybe a way through that is to just argue that, this is a core to Deutero-Isaiah and it goes back to Isaiah. But yeah, he also has like an interesting, and this is one of the key indicators to me that, a lot of scholars within Mormon studies that are working in this, because Kent Jackson's really kind of been one of the, a major scholar in the last 30, 40 years, engaging with Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. He says in passing, and I engage with this in the essay, that, if you go with all of the reasons why scholars are dividing up, 1 through 39 from 40 through 66, based on style, based on historical references, based on all that kind of stuff, you could do the same thing with 1 through 39. And I remember when I first read that in 2016, it was like, that's exactly what biblical scholars do. Like that is what they do. Are you not reading them? So that was kind of the first indication.
Yeah, so this gets exactly to sort of the big innovation that you make. So what is the big sort of contribution that you're putting forward in this article?
Yeah, so I'm leaning heavily on the work of H.G.M. Williamson and his student. They were both at Oxford, Stromberg, Jacob Stromberg. Jacob Stromberg did his PhD at Oxford with Williamson. In the 1990s, Williamson had this it's one of my favorite books. It's called the book called Isaiah. And the whole argument of that book is trying to figure out, okay, here's the whole breadth of Isaiah scholarship. Where are the places that we all agree, really like actually agree about the composition history of different verses and different parts of the text of Isaiah? And how can I explain the final form of 1 through 39 through looking at how the author of 40 through 55 might have influenced or rewritten parts or revised that part of the text. And so he does this. It's just a fantastic book. He shows how Deutero-Isaiah, whoever that was, rewrote and also wrote some full chapters in 1 through 39. And then Jacob Stromberg in the first decade of the 2000s completes his PhD, and then it gets published in 2011 by Oxford University Press. And I think it's called Isaiah After Exile. And in there, he does basically that same thing, but he asks, if we look at third Isaiah, how did the author of third Isaiah influence both Deutero-Isaiah and first Isaiah? Everyone has always agreed that the first chapter was written probably near the end of the composition history of the book of Isaiah. It has a lot of connections, lexically, thematically, everything with chapter 66. It works as an introduction to the entire book. 2, at the beginning of chapter 2, has its own introduction to the book. There are a couple of different introductions in the first part, in the first few chapters of Isaiah. So basically where I come in is saying, hey, these two scholars are really, really important. Their work is incredible. Their methodology, I think, is really fantastic, because instead of just sort of carving out their own area and saying, well, this is totally my idea over here against everybody else, they say, where do we all actually agree? And how might we use that to actually move forward to really understand the composition history of this book? And I think they've been really successful in that way. So yeah, I show that not only is third Isaiah a part of rewriting, some of the chapters that are in the Book of Mormon, 48 through 54. Third Isaiah actually wrote some verses there, but Deutero-Isaiah and third Isaiah also wrote parts of 2 through 14. And that just hadn't been brought into the conversation at all yet. So yeah, it's really just, an invitation to anyone working on the Bible and the Book of Mormon to say, let's really fully actually engage with, mainstream biblical scholarship and bring that into this conversation, and, make sure that everything's being thorough and exhaustive, and that, that'll help to understand the text better.
So even if there was an actual historical Isaiah that is attributed to those early chapters, those chapters were revised again and again by later authors, including second and third Isaiah, who are revising them. And so the version that we get in the Book of Mormon, none of it really comes from before the exile. All of it is after the exile, or after Joseph and Lehi and Nephi. I'm getting them all wrong now. After they leave Jerusalem. So everything in Isaiah that we have is basically a post-exilic product. And so we face that. So is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the shape and the form that it's in, yes.
Yeah.
I could see someone pushing back on that and saying, no, there are parts of 2 through 14 that go back to Isaiah, and that's true. But no, in the form that it is in, a full block quotation of 2 through 14 and presented as a full, complete scriptural text, that wouldn't have been possible. And 48 through 54, of course, is later. And I do examine a handful, maybe about a half dozen or a little more, of cases where language from third Isaiah gets alluded to, gets just sort of referenced in passing. And so, outside of the actual block quotations that have third Isaiah, outside of that, there are verses that indicate that, concepts and language from third Isaiah are being integrated into passages in the Book of Mormon.
So a lot of the research that went into this was close, detailed analysis of quotations, sometimes allusions, and sometimes things that people hadn't even recognized were quotations or allusions beforehand. Tell us a little bit about the process of the research, the close textual research that went into this article, and sort of how you went about doing it.
Yeah, it's a decades-long process. I started during my undergrad. I was kind of surprised, engaging with biblical scholarship to sort of shift over during my undergrad in the religious studies program at the University of Utah, to find that there weren't really very many resources for this kind of thing. So I started going, initially, this was 2013, I started going through the Book of Mormon just phrase by phrase, and annotating everything. That's obviously a really long process. You have to sit with each phrase. You have to kind of tweak them too and see, okay, does this actually make sense? And then eventually, I think by end of 2013 or early 2014, I found out that the Maxwell Institute had a really great tool, some software called Word Cruncher, and it was made for doing exactly this. So I worked with the guys that sort of run and take care of Word Cruncher and update it. And they kind of taught me how to use that. So they actually invited me to write an article that's still up, I think, at the Maxwell Institute's website, that goes through how to run what's called a phrase compare report. So it's my approach to this, my methodology. It's complicated. I'm dependent on literary scholarship and how biblical scholars have utilized that literary scholarship to understand the intertextual connections between different books. And so a big part of my process is going through and running those phrase compare reports. You basically get stacks of paper. You have to go through and sort of manually delete duplicates. But then once you have that all kind of cut down, you have lots and lots of phrases. So the basis for this study, I finished, I think, somewhere around 2016. And I had this huge stack, basically a manuscript of all of the different phrases that I'd cut down and cut down and cut down and compared and labeled and said, oh, okay, this is a formal quotation or an informal quotation, or maybe it's an allusion or an echo or a parallel. Those are the main phrases that scholars like me, like Nick Frederick, like Richard Hayes, like others use in this kind of study. And it was that moment, I think that was around 2016, maybe early 2017. I went through the whole list and I was like, oh, there's there's definitely third Isaiah in here. What's everybody talking about? So I sort of took all of that and then started implementing that into a larger. At some point, I would like to get published a reference edition of the 1830 Book of Mormon that actually has all of these annotations, so that everybody can just have access to that. Yeah, I've just slowly kind of picked that apart. But then on the side as well, I have a critical edition of all of the biblical quotations in the Book of Mormon that I've been working on since 2013 as well. That will be published as a supplement online on the journal's website. But I'm just currently finishing doing the final touches on that. And that was really kind of the major basis for this study, was going through and doing that. The huge benefit of that critical edition is that not only is it a critical edition, so I have the 1830 text that I've made slight changes to dependent on some of Skousen's work. Royal Skousen's work is really important for understanding what Joseph Smith might have actually dictated to the scribes. So based on that, I don't always follow him. There are many places where I disagree with him. And then the critical apparatus itself notates where the 1830 text, the critical text, varies from the King James Version, but then also on those variants, what the original manuscript says if it exists, the printer's manuscript, the 1830, and Skousen's earliest text says. So once that's all published, that'll be available for others to do this kind of work. But I think one of the major contributions too is that I've gone through and letter by letter highlighted in gray where it's the exact same as the King James Version text. And that makes it possible for anyone else to just focus on the white text or the white areas of the text. And that's the variant. That's where, the text of the Book of Mormon differs. So that's really a big part. And I have I've published I've submitted other essays for publication on that. So it's a bigger project than just this one, this essay.
Colby, that is painstaking work, detailed work, many, many hours, years, even as you mentioned, of this kind. And so we're very fortunate to see the payoffs of all of this. How do you think this article contributes to broader Book of Mormon studies more generally?
Yeah, I would like to think that it would contribute methodologically, that it would actually invite others to not only directly engage with biblical scholarship, which I think is a huge. I mean, I love Kent Jackson's work, but I really was kind of disappointed to see that little, passing comment of, scholars do do what you're implying, and so those kinds of things, paying more attention to outside, scholarship on and how that, what that has to say about the Book of Mormon. But then also, the kind of detailed, close reading and, looking at how the Book of Mormon takes up the King James Version, I think is really important. Because even right now, there are some publications that will be coming out soon that basically say that we don't have to pay attention to anything outside of the actual formal quotations, because that doesn't matter. We don't know if it's allusions or anything else. We don't have anything. We can't say that. And my response to that basically is, yeah, we can. I mean, look at my work, look at Nick Frederick's work, look at so many others who have done this kind of work. But there's also that limits people, because not only in this essay do you find this, but in my previous one on Malachi in the Book of Mormon, Nephi formally quotes Malachi without saying his name. And so that also has implications for, the argument that, oh, well, the other stuff isn't formally quoted, so it doesn't matter. And it's no, it does. And why is Nephi formally quoting Malachi when the book explicitly knows and says that they don't have Malachi? I think these are really interesting questions. And it all comes down to methodology, I think. What are you going to actually directly engage with, and how is that going to influence your reading?
Colby, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. We hope that our listeners have enjoyed this conversation and have learned something new about Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. If you'd like to learn more, we encourage you to check out Colby Townsend's article in the fall 2022 issue of Dialogue, The Robe of Righteousness, Exilic and Post-Exilic Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, and to explore other resources on this topic and more at dialoguejournal.com. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in for future episodes to our podcast, and we look forward to continuing the conversation on Mormon studies scholarship. Until next time.